The text came on a Wednesday afternoon while I was finishing a report at my desk. Short, casual, emergency work situation, flying out tonight. Don't wait up. 8 years of marriage and she had never once had an emergency business trip. I read the message twice. I set my phone face down on the desk. And then I started thinking the way I always think when something does not add up, methodically, one variable at a time, working from what I know toward what I do not. My name is Thomas. I am 39 and I work as a systems auditor for a financial services company in Atlanta. My job is built entirely around one skill, finding the gap between what a record says happened and what actually happened. I follow document trails. I cross-reference timestamps. I identify the point at which a story and the evidence supporting it stop matching. I have been doing it professionally for 12 years and I am good at it. I was about to apply every bit of that skill to my own marriage. Welcome to Story Sparks. Subscribe before this story ends because this one earns it. Drop a like if you stay. Now let's get into Thomas's story. Thomas and his wife, a woman named Karen, had been together for a decade and married for 8 of those years. Karen worked as an account director for a marketing firm, a demanding and social role that had always justified irregular hours and the occasional work dinner. Thomas had never questioned any of it because he had no reason to. Until the 3 months leading up to that Wednesday, he would have described their marriage as solid, if quieter than it had once been. He had filed the quietness under the ordinary settling that happens when two people have been building a life together long enough for the novelty to become something more durable. What he had not filed correctly, he would later understand, was a pattern he had been observing without naming. Karen had become privately engaged with her phone in a way that was different from normal. She had been working late with a regularity that had slightly outpaced her usual schedule. There had been a distance in the evenings, subtle but consistent, the kind of distance that is easy to explain away one instance at a time and harder to ignore once you step back and look at the full 3-month shape of it. The emergency business trip text was the detail that stopped fitting. Thomas knew Karen's firm used an internal travel portal for all bookings. She had complained about the system more than once, describing it as slow and difficult to navigate. Her work laptop was in the home office. Her login credentials were saved in the browser. He opened the portal that evening before she came home to pack her bag. There were no bookings, no pending travel, no emergency authorization. The most recent entry in the system was from a conference she had attended 3 months earlier, a trip Thomas remembered because he had dropped her at the airport. He closed the laptop. He sat in the chair in the quiet office for a while. Then he heard her car in the driveway. She came through the door with a small overnight bag and the particular focused energy of someone executing a plan. She was dressed more carefully than she usually dressed for travel. She gave him the details in the efficient, rehearsed way of someone who had prepared the answers in advance. United flight, Chicago, client emergency, back tomorrow afternoon. She kissed his forehead and left. He watched her car disappear from the window. 45 minutes later, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Karen's office line. Her boss was on the other end, apologetic and confused, asking whether everything was all right at home because Karen had missed the Morrison account presentation that afternoon, the biggest client pitch of her quarter, one she had been preparing for weeks, and nobody at the office could reach her. Thomas told him Karen had gone to Chicago on an emergency business trip. Her boss told him, carefully and with evident discomfort, that their firm had no business in Chicago and no emergency travel scheduled. Thomas thanked him, said he would have her call when she was available, and hung up. He sat with that information for a long time, not in a state of collapse, but in the particular stillness that arrives when something you have been half-sensing finally resolves into something you can see clearly. He had spent 3 months absorbing small inconsistencies individually. In the space of one phone call, they had assembled themselves into a coherent picture. He opened his laptop and pulled up their joint bank account. He went through the previous 3 months with the same methodical attention he brought to any financial audit. Most of the charges were ordinary: groceries, gas, her usual patterns. But there were others that did not fit the narrative she had been providing alongside them. A dinner at an upscale Italian restaurant on a Tuesday she had described as a late night at the office. A hotel charge downtown on a Saturday she had been at a work seminar. Small, individual, easily dismissed. Together, across 90 days, they formed a ledger with a consistent direction. He checked her car's navigation history through the app she had connected to his phone months earlier when she was unfamiliar with a route and had asked him to help. She had not thought about it since. The history showed repeated visits to an apartment complex across town on the same evenings she had described as overtime. The same location across a 2-month span. 12 visits, always between early evening and late night. Never mentioned. Thomas took screenshots of everything. He did not yet know the full story, but he knew enough to understand that what he was looking at was not a business trip. It was the surface layer of something that had been running parallel to his marriage for a significant period of time, structured carefully, funded separately, and maintained through a volume of deliberate, daily deception that took sustained effort to produce. Here is something worth understanding about what Thomas did next, and why it mattered more than it might appear. He did not confront Corinne that night when she texted from wherever she actually was, adding fake details about meetings going well, building the fiction another layer higher. He did not call her and demand an explanation. He did not spiral into an emotional state that would have consumed his judgment and handed her the ability to control the conversation. He gathered information. He organized it. He thought about what he actually knew versus what he still needed to understand. And then he waited until he was ready to have the conversation from a position of clarity rather than chaos. This distinction matters because it speaks to something real about how people navigate betrayal, and it is not the instinct most of us have in the moment. The instinct is to react immediately, to release the pressure of what you now know, to confront and demand and break the surface. That instinct is human and understandable. But acting from that place hands the other person a significant advantage, because they can respond to your emotion rather than to the evidence, and they can control the narrative by managing your state rather than answering your questions. Thomas denied her that advantage. When she came home the next afternoon, composed and rolling her overnight bag behind her, he was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and an apparently ordinary evening in front of him. He asked about Chicago. She described the hotel. He noted that her credit card had no charges from any hotel in Chicago. He mentioned that United had no direct flights to Chicago on Wednesday evenings. He asked about the Morrison presentation. She produced explanations for each discrepancy, each one slightly less plausible than the last, each one requiring the one before it to already be true. He watched her build the structure and he watched it fail under the weight of its own architecture. When he told her that her boss had called and that the Morrison account had been told she had a family emergency, not a scheduling conflict, not a business trip, a family emergency, the scaffolding came down. The explanation stopped producing new explanations. She sat across from him in the kitchen with her story exhausted and the evidence arranged quietly on the table between them. She told him the truth, all of it in the sequence it had happened. A consultant at a client firm, 6 months of professional contact, 3 months of something else, regular meetings at his apartment across town. On the evenings Thomas now had documented in GPS coordinates and timestamps. The overnight trip had been the most recent instance of something that had been happening throughout the same period. Thomas had been noticing the quietness and attributing it to the ordinary settling of a long marriage. She told him she had not planned for it to become what it became. He told her that it had become what it became through 90 consecutive days of active choice, and that the word for that was not accident. He told her the marriage was over. She said they could go to counseling. He asked what counseling could address. He asked how he was supposed to rebuild trust with someone who had demonstrated, across 3 months of documented daily behavior, that she could look at him directly and lie without visible difficulty. He was not asking rhetorically. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to understand what the theory of repair looked like in practice, and he could not find one that held. She stayed in the house that night. He slept in the spare room. He called his brother, who had always been more skeptical of the marriage than Thomas had appreciated at the time, and asked for the name of a good attorney. He called her sister, not to be cruel, but because he understood that the version of events Karen would offer her family would be shaped by the same instinct toward narrative management that had produced the fake business trip. And he wanted someone close to Karen to have access to the actual facts. He was careful throughout to communicate what had happened without embellishment and without performance. Just the timeline, just the evidence, just the documentation. The next morning he called her employer, not to accelerate her professional consequences, but because her boss had called him in good faith asking about a situation that was affecting the company's most important client relationship. And the answer Thomas had given him at the time had been incomplete, because Thomas had also been incomplete at the time. He corrected the record. He described the pattern of deceptions that had touched Karen's professional responsibilities, confining himself to the facts that were directly relevant to the business she had affected. Her boss told him this explained a deterioration in performance that the firm had been attributing to burnout. Thomas did not feel satisfied by this outcome. He did not feel victorious. He felt the particular heaviness of watching a structure that he had believed was solid reveal that it had been hollow in places he had not inspected closely enough. The divorce took 6 weeks. Karen attempted to slow the process in the hope that time would produce reconsideration. Thomas experienced no reconsideration. His attorney was thorough and clear-eyed, and the documentation Thomas had compiled over those initial days of investigation made the factual foundation of the proceedings straightforward. When the papers were signed at the courthouse, Karen asked him if he thought about what they could have been if things had gone differently. He told her they had been something. They had been married for 8 years. They had built a life that had genuine value and genuine history. The question was not what they could have been, but what she had chosen when she decided what they were was not sufficient. He told her to take care of herself, and he meant it. Then he walked to his car. Let's talk about what this story is actually about, because it is not primarily about an affair or a divorce. It is about something more universal that appears in many forms across many kinds of relationships and situations. It is about the relationship between information and response. Most of us, when confronted with something that does not fit the story we have been told, have two available moves. The first is to absorb the discrepancy into the existing story, to find the interpretation that preserves what we believe and explains away what challenges it. The second is to follow the discrepancy where it actually leads, even when that destination is somewhere we would not have chosen. The first move is more comfortable in the short term. It requires nothing of us except the willingness to look slightly away from what we have seen. Thomas had been making the first move for 3 months. The slightly too private phone, the slightly more frequent late evenings, the slight but persistent distance, each instance individually explained, collectively, quietly accumulating. The Wednesday text was the moment the accumulation reached a threshold he could not absorb. And what he did from that threshold forward was follow the evidence precisely where it went, without rushing to a conclusion he was not yet sure of, and without stalling on a conclusion he had already reached. There is a concept in decision theory called the commitment problem. It describes the difficulty of acting on information that has genuine costs attached to it. The information may be clear. The logic of what to do with it may be clear, but the action required costs something significant: a relationship, a shared history, a version of your life that you had been building and expected to keep building. The commitment problem is why people stay in situations they have already correctly diagnosed as untenable, why they absorb the discrepancies rather than follow them, why they choose the story over the evidence when the evidence is inconvenient enough. Thomas did not do this, not because he felt no cost. He felt the full cost clearly, but he had spent 12 years professionally developing the skill of following evidence to its actual conclusion rather than to a comfortable one, and that skill did not stop working just because the audit was personal. He emerged from the process with something that people who have spent years in gradually deteriorating situations often describe with the specific word he used. Not happiness exactly, not in the immediate aftermath of something that was genuinely painful, but freedom. The freedom of a person who has removed something that was quietly consuming energy he had not realized was being consumed. He had been spending mental and emotional resources every evening for 3 months on the low-grade work of sensing that something was wrong without being able to name it. That work does not announce itself. It just runs in the background, drawing down your attention, dulling your engagement with everything else, occupying space you did not know was occupied until the occupation ends. When Corinne moved out and the house went quiet, the quiet was a different kind than the quiet of the previous months. It was the quiet of a space that belonged to him rather than the quiet of a space where something was being concealed. He went back to the gym. He hiked more. He slept through the night, which he had not done consistently in a while, though he had attributed the disruption to work stress rather than its actual source. He received a promotion 8 months after the divorce, the kind of advancement that had been available to him for longer than he had fully pursued it. He bought a house he chose for himself without compromise. He reconnected with people he had drifted from during the marriage, not as a project of reconstruction, just as the natural consequence of having more of himself available than he had had before. He ran into Corinne's sister in a grocery store about 6 months after everything was final. She told him Corinne was working at a smaller firm now, still rebuilding, still adjusting to the shape of the consequences her choices had produced. She said Corinne asked about him sometimes. Thomas said he hoped she was doing well. He meant it. The relationship with the consultant had not survived contact with ordinary life. Relationships that begin as an escape from something tend to require the escape to sustain themselves. Once Corinne and the consultant were no longer hiding from anything, what they had turned out to be was two people who had made mutually destructive choices and were now dealing with the results separately. Thomas does not spend much time thinking about any of this now. He has said, when asked directly, that the main thing the experience taught him was not to distrust people, which would be the wrong lesson, but to trust his own perception, to take seriously the things he notices rather than immediately finding explanations for why they do not mean what they appear to mean. Not as paranoia, as respect for his own capacity to read a situation accurately. He had read the situation accurately for 3 months. He had just kept filing the readings away rather than acting on them. When he finally acted, he did it with the full evidence in hand and the full clarity that comes from following something all the way to where it actually goes rather than where it would be more convenient for it to stop. That combination, accurate perception plus the willingness to act on it even at cost, is not something most of us are taught. We are taught to give people the benefit of the doubt, to look for the generous interpretation, to preserve relationships through absorption rather than address them through honesty. These are not bad instincts. In most circumstances, they produce better outcomes than their alternatives. But there is a version of them that shades into something that does not serve you. A version where you extend the benefit of the doubt past the point at which the doubt has been resolved. Where you preserve a relationship by absorbing what the relationship is actually doing to you. Where you choose the story over the evidence because the evidence is too costly to follow. Thomas followed the evidence. 8 years of marriage ended in 3 days of documentation and one honest conversation. What came after was quieter, smaller in some external ways, and considerably more his own. If Thomas's story gave you something real to think about, tell me which part stayed with you in the comments. The kitchen table conversation. The moment the travel portal came up empty. The thing he said at the courthouse. I read every comment here. And if this is the kind of story that brings you to Story Sparks, subscribe so you do not miss what we put out every week. Drop a like if this earned it. We will see you in the next one.